Last week, we've been doing this series on worship. And this is a simple stool. I couldn't find a throne. I looked in the attic of the church, no thrones up there. So can we use our imagination here this morning? This is the throne of your heart. And last week, we talked about how you're worshiping God or you're worshiping something else. The throne of your heart this morning, it is not unoccupied. Everybody is worshiping something. The most important commandment when Jesus was asked, he said, love God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. The first two of the 10 Commandments, no gods before me and no idols. And it's interesting, you look at that, and great disappointment for myself and anybody else named Aaron is immediately after, right? God goes over the 10 Commandments, first two, no gods, no idols. I'll be right back. Moses comes down from the mountain, and everybody is bowing down to a golden calf that they had made. It's like, come on! It's like a parent, right? You go out to the grocery store and you tell your kids, hey, just don't burn the place down. And you get back and the fire department is there. The smoldering pit where the house used to be. You had one job. And it wasn't just those people right then. I mean, the entire story of the Old Testament. In every age, the major theme of nearly every prophet is the issue of people constantly bending their hearts toward things other than God. You're either worshiping God or something else. Jonah 2:8, those who cling, that word cling instead of God to worthless idols, turn away from God's love for them. Now, they didn't burn down the temple of God, and they didn't abandon the worship of the living God. What they tended to do was kind of like worship Yahweh, the God of the Bible, and Baal. And so that they would build on every high place and every hill, they'd have all these little altars dotted around the countryside where they would go to the various local deities, and then they would go to the temple. And later on, they began bringing, you remember Solomon allowed his wives to build temples to Molech and Asherah. And they began to erect even these idols within the temple of the living God. It is the main reason given for the exile of the Jewish nation. And here's our problem, right? Because we read that, we look at the first two commandments, and we skip over them. We skip over them because we look at our house and we say, well, I don't have anything that looks like that. Right? I'm not, we don't go down the street. I mean, maybe you've been to a Chinese food place and they have like a Buddha statue or something. But other than that, we view idolatry, the worship of idols, as something that is either located in foreign lands or in the distant past. And how is it that we think that the major struggle of the Old Testament is somehow just stopped becoming an issue for the human heart? Here's a verse out of Ezekiel. Ezekiel is a prophet, and the people had already been exiled for worshiping idols. And after that point, the Jewish people, something interesting happens. After they come back from the exile, they are no longer building idols. From that period on in Jewish history, the worship of idols just disappears. But here's what Ezekiel tells to the people who come to him asking, what does God want us to do? God says, Son of man, these men have set up idols in their hearts and put wicked stumbling blocks before their faces. Should I let them inquire of me at all? And that had to be shocking to the guys coming before him because they tore down all that stuff. Right? And God says, no, you've just exchanged something made of gold for something in your heart. We skip to the New Testament, we find this. Sorry, I've got the verse wrong. This isn't in Ezekiel, this is in Colossians. Colossians 3:5. Put to death, therefore, whatever belongs to your earthly nature. And he names some things: sexual immorality, impurity, lust, evil desires. Listen to this phrase. And greed, which is idolatry. Now that's interesting because I don't know about you, I've never taken out a paycheck and put it, down on the table and bowed down to it, oh mighty dollar. Right? We don't drive down 63 and see temples built to wealth. Well, perhaps we do. So when we talk about the worship of idols, let us not forget that it is not just images beaten out of gold or silver. We set them up in our hearts. Jesus says of wealth, by the way, you cannot serve both God and wealth. You can't have two masters in your life. So an idol is anything that we set on the throne of our life, and we sacrifice things to it that we should only give to God. And we ask it to fill things in our lives that only God can fill. And it is so easy. I would like to name some of our idols this morning. The prophets did that. And I'm certainly not one of them, but this is something that concerns me greatly as a pastor, and I care about all of you. And when we have idols in our hearts, it turns us away from the love of God. Let me start with something very obvious. Now, this is cream soda, but I didn't have time to go by Casey's for a bottle of Jack Daniel. It is very easy to see how alcohol and substance abuse can become a god for people. Right? Because we serve a God who may at any time call us to sacrifice for Him, right? Our jobs, our health, our family, our own lives. But my mom, for alcohol, sacrificed her job, her health, her relationships, her family, and eventually her life on this altar. People who have struggled with addiction, you know. You watch your family members, you know that this becomes God very quickly. It becomes the single most important thing in that person's life. And when it is threatened, there is rage. And everything is poured out before it. Now that's kind of easy to see, and I think generally our culture would agree with us on that being a false god. Let me show you one that is very celebrated in our culture. You'll have to excuse my poor prop making here. Sex is the god of our world right now. I don't know if you've heard of the book series 50 Shades of Grey. It was fascinating for me to watch as this very pornographic fiction series became a thing not to be missed. We're seeing on Facebook somebody posting, I pray, oh God, to send me someone like Christian Grey. Because that's what we do when we set something up as God in our life. We have this expectation in our culture that if I can find that satisfaction through pleasure, I will finally be complete. That I find my greatest identity in my sexual behavior. But I'll tell you, this is more common, I think, within the church. My wife worked with churchgoers who could not understand why she did not want to go and watch the movie when it came out with them. I did a survey, Christian Mingle, Christian dating site. And they just asked them, how do you feel about your sexual behavior and how God's word lines up with that? And it was something like less than 15% said that they had no intention of any sexual activity before marriage. And it wasn't like saying oh, I struggle with this, or I acknowledge that it is wrong. There's just no intention. I have a close friend in ministry, and she's single, and she shared with us her experience of going on a Christian dating site, posting on a profile, I'm looking for a man of God. I am a pastor. And she told us how time and time again this would happen. She'd go on the first date, and she said, look, I just want to tell you, here's the deal. Any sexual activity is off the table until the day of marriage for me. I mean, that's just a decision that I've made in obedience to God. And she said, you would not believe how many people showed up for that. And when I said that, they walked out. And what they were declaring there is that they are unwilling to compromise what's on the throne of their heart. They're sticking to their values, their value being pleasure above all else. And if God interferes with that, well, then I'm going to hold on to this. I can't tell you how many men have sacrificed their families on the altar to this particular idol through pornography addiction. It becomes God. Now, it's difficult with some of these things because, sex is not inherently evil. We'll talk later this year. It'll be interesting. We'll talk about how sex is a gift from God. And yet we are asked to honor the boundaries that he sets around it. So an idol doesn't have to be something that is as horrible as crystal meth. It can be anything that we allow to sit on that throne. Let me give you another example of something. Work. Work isn't evil. It's a good thing. You should be out there doing what you can to provide for your family. But we lived in a military town, right outside of the largest Marine Corps base in the nation. I can't tell you how many times I talked to a young Marine who was approaching that day when he would no longer be a Marine. And for them, it is like staring over the edge of a cliff. I don't know what this will hold. Because for years, they hammer it into, you are a Marine. That is who you are. That is what your life is wrapped around. And they struggle with not allowing it to become the source of their identity. Now I'm not saying you can't work crazy hours, because you have to go through that and provide for your family. I'm not saying, for instance, that you have to spend more time in prayer than you spend working. I think that would be kind of insane. But we have to be on guard. And I've seen people who have sacrificed their family at the altar of their job. I've talked to people where I honestly wonder if God were to show up to them and say, all right, here is what I require from you to surrender your job. Think of the rich young ruler who came to Jesus and he said, just sell everything. That some people, if God were to go to them, they've got a small business they have nurtured from the ground up. And they've poured their life savings into it and their lives into it. If God were to say, in following me, I'm calling you to give that up, they would not be able to. It has become an idol. Can I get really personal here for a second? You know what I mean. Like they used to have, portable idols, Terrafin, they would carry around with them. I think we've got the same things today. I think the 5 most horrible words that Christine has spoken to me. Daddy, put the phone down. She is part of a generation of kids who family experts look at and say, we don't know what's going to happen to them because it is a generation of kids being raised and their parents are literally unable to tear their attention away from the God that we carry in our pockets long enough to spend time with them. I mean, the Israelites, they built altars to Molech and they burned their kids thinking it would bring rain. We sacrifice our kids to rounded rectangles with shiny screens, trying to see what our remote relatives are up to today. And it's not just, our phones. I can just, again, say personally, like in my life, I was a video game addict. Your entertainment. You get home, and that's the thing you've been looking forward to all week. All day at work, you're going to get home and you're going to do that. If something gets in your way, God help them. You want to experience rage? Turn off your Wi-Fi router when your teenager gets home. You just turned off their God. And again, I'll just say, technology isn't bad. I'm not saying you got to go out and, burn your phones today. But we allow these things to sit on that throne of our hearts, and it crowds out everything else. One that I've continued to struggle with. I could have some of you come and sit here. We carry this around, and we allow other people to sit on that and their opinions of us. Take that spot in our hearts. And you see this 2 ways, and the first is pretty obvious. It's pride. It is the approval of other people. Book of Proverbs says that crucibles test gold and silver for their purity. They would put them gold and silver in a fire and melt it down. Men are tested by the praises they receive. And I'll tell you, for people in the public eye, it is so easy. You begin to live for other people's affirmation of you. Good job. Wow, that's incredible. You are so great. And we build like a trophy room in our heart, and it is filled with those moments of people looking at us and applauding, and those fantasies where we see ourselves in the spotlight. It becomes God. And it will never be satisfied. It will never be enough. People on Instagram, 7 million followers, still worrying about their daily numbers. Still insecure about themselves because it is a God that will never be satisfied. And other people allow the opinions of other people to take that spot in the other direction, and insecurity and fear. What are people going to think of me? What are people going to say about me? We live in a small town, and I know that rumor mill is just always generating new stories. And we can allow that to begin to make decisions for us. The things that I do, and I'll be honest, some people just find it easier to cut themselves off from human contact because of the fear of rejection. And I'll say, as a pastor, we sit there And I had this camp meeting, one of the messages, I went forward to the altar and prayed, and I forget exactly, I think it was like something like this, do you have idols in your heart? You need to surrender every sin to Jesus. And sometimes I have that feeling like, if I go forward and pray for this, what are people going to think of a pastor, right, going forward during an altar call? And I'm willing to bet that there are people who sit there, and I'm not saying like you can't be forgiven and God can't work on you like sitting there, but there are people who sit in churches. And they're desperate for somebody to pray with them. But it is the singular fear of other people's opinions and what they might think and what they might say after church that keeps them glued to their seats and alone in their struggle. There are relationships that die. There are relationships that die the slow death in fear of reaching out for help because somebody will judge me. Because Pastor Aaron must think that we're all perfect people. We all have the best relationship in the world. And if I go to him or if I go to somebody else and say, please help, we are drowning, it is that fear of what that other person thinks of you that dominates and makes those decisions for you. Can I get more personal? And this is a scary one in the church. Your kids and your spouse can sit here. And it's hard because it's a good thing, right? I love Sarah more than any other person in this world. I've loved her for a long time. I would lay my life down for my family. But she is not God. And if we go into a relationship with somebody and we're placing on them the burden of our joy and our peace and contentedness in life, there is no way possible for a human being to carry that burden. I mean, Sarah comes pretty close, but our kids. You love your family. We say in the church, love your family. We have family events and ministries of the church built around supporting the family. Those are good things. But here is the scary thing. Make sure I get this right. In a Barna survey, they asked Christian women, what is the most important role in your life? 5-1. They chose being a mother or parent over being a follower of Christ. It wasn't even close. Same thing when they asked them, what is your highest priority in life? Being a mom. Jesus, a distant second. And people can begin to view God as a means to an end. I know that there are people who come to church not because of a burning desire to become closer to God, but because what they really want at the heart of it all is a better relationship with their kids or their spouse. Now, I'm not saying that it's wrong to desire that, because these are good things. And like I said, I mean, you put your work over your kids, your priorities are out of balance. But the problem is, when I look at my daughter and I say, it is now your job to make me happy. It is now your job to give my life purpose and meaning. She is a cute kid, but she is a bad God. And you want to crush your kids? Put that weight on them. saddle them with that kind of expectation, there is no way possible they will ever live up to it. And again, just to be very clear here, Jesus' words, not mine. Anyone who loves their father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. Anyone who loves their son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. God, He is just not interested in playing a secondary role in our lives. And the answer, by the way, is not to love our kids less. It's to love God more. And then we sit on the throne. We sit on the throne of our lives and we say, I will make the shots. I will decide what I do. Because you're going to come to a point, and maybe today, this message is one of those points where you are faced with an aspect of God that is hard for you to grasp. And you're going to have a decision to make. I remember a very promising young man who was a part of our student ministry, extremely bright, gifted, new in the faith. And we began to talk as he was studying through the Word, and he got hung up on the idea of, in his case, it was hell. How can that be a real thing? And met with him many times, talked with him, prayed with him. Eventually, he made the decision to reject that concept. He walked away. And here's the thing. We do not get to define God. That is an idol. Isaiah 2:8, their land is full of idols. They bow down to the work of their hands, to what their fingers have made. And time again, they call the Israelites out. You made this. How can you bow down to it? But I tell you today, if we are not willing to go to God as He is, you are not worshiping God. I don't get to decide what God desires from me. I don't get to decide how tall He is, what His face looks like. If I'm shaping that and I'm molding that to my expectations, I am creating an idol. So what do we do? Like I said, this is something that we continue to struggle with. And I swear, sometimes to you it feels like I am just trying to edge Jesus, off the seat, like He's there. I'm just trying to get a corner, a hold on it. And maybe just today, you're at that point of acknowledging, if I'm completely honest with myself, I have something else sitting on that. What do I do? Begins with honesty, for one. Before the Israelites entered the promised land, Joshua spoke to them. Now remember, they'd been brought out of Egypt. God had performed miracles in preserving them, but what they had done, they had carried with them all this way idols from their homeland. And so He talks to them. Sorry, actually, as I look at the chapter number, this is after they've entered. He's giving his closing address. He says, "Now fear the Lord and serve Him with all faithfulness. Throw away the gods your ancestors worshipped beyond the Euphrates River in Egypt, and serve the Lord. But if serving the Lord seems undesirable to you, then choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve. Whether the gods your ancestors served beyond the Euphrates, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you're living. But as for me and my household, we will serve the Lord. So I tell you that God wants to do things through this church and through us. God wants to do things in my life. And so we are called to make that choice if we realize, we open the bags of our hearts and we realize, I've been carrying an idol with me for 20 years. Throw it away. If it's a good thing, you've been idolizing your spouse or your job, something neutral like technology, put it in its proper place. And worship and serve God. Allow Him to fill that role in your life. Now we're going to pray and we're going to sing, and I just want to give opportunity. If you'd like to come forward and pray before the Lord this morning. If you want somebody to pray with you, you can come to this side. If you'd like just to spend some time alone with God, you can do that where you sit, or if you want to come to this side as well. Let's pray. God, you are greater than anything we can imagine. Greater in love and righteousness, in holiness and splendor. So I pray that you would forgive us for the times that we place other things on that throne. Things that can never fulfill, never answer our calls. God, I pray this morning that you would reveal any idol that we have set up in our hearts before you. God, we know that we can't cast them down in our own strength. I just pray that you would so wash over us in the power of your Spirit and your love. God, that you would do what we cannot, and to set things right in our hearts and minds. Most of all, that you would fill us with a longing to glorify you in the same way and beyond the way that we serve other things. That our worship of you would be unadulterated and pure